The autumn wind of 1887 carried whispers through the streets of Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory, and those whispers all centered on one person, Sarah Crowfeather, the new schoolteacher whose Cheyenne heritage had set the entire town ablaze with controversy. Jake Thompson heard the gossip during his monthly supply run, the same voices that had been buzzing for weeks since Sarah's arrival. Standing 6 feet tall with weathered hands and eyes the color of mountain storms, Jake had spent the last 8 years in self-imposed isolation on his cattle ranch high in the Rocky Mountains, coming to town only when absolutely necessary. "I'm telling you, Martha," hissed Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, as she clutched her shopping basket tighter, "it's unnatural having an Indian teaching our children. What kind of values is she filling their heads with?" "She's educated, though," replied Martha hesitantly. "Graduated from that fancy school back east. The Territorial Education Board wouldn't have sent her if she wasn't qualified." "Education or not," interrupted Samuel Morrison, the town's self-appointed moral authority, "blood will tell. You can't civilize a savage no matter how many books you force into their head. Mark my words, she'll corrupt our children with her heathen ways." Jake had seen Sarah Crowfeather only once, walking with quiet dignity down Main Street while hostile eyes followed her every step. She was 26, with intelligent dark eyes and an bearing that spoke of inner strength. Her long black hair was neatly arranged in the Eastern fashion, and her simple but well-made dress suggested both practicality and refinement. What struck Jake most was her composure. She walked through the gauntlet of stares and whispers with her head held high, neither defiant nor cowering, simply present and unashamed. "She's more educated than half the people in this town," Jake said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the gossip like a blade. The conversation stopped abruptly. Morrison turned to face Jake, his face flushing red. Well, if it isn't our hermit cowboy. Didn't expect to see you defending the Indian, Thompson. Though I suppose living alone in those mountains for so long might affect a man's judgment." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I'm not defending anyone. I'm stating a fact. The woman has credentials from institutions most folks here couldn't even pronounce." "Credentials don't change what she is," Morrison sneered. "And they don't change the fact that she's filling our children's minds with God knows what kind of nonsense. Some of the parents are talking about pulling their kids out of school entirely." That evening, Jake found himself riding not toward his mountain cabin but toward the small schoolhouse on the edge of town. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of lamplight and the silhouette of a woman bent over papers at her desk. Sarah Crowfeather was grading assignments, her concentration complete despite the late hour. Jake dismounted and approached the door, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden steps. He knocked gently, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal Sarah's face, wary but unafraid. "Mr. Thompson," she said, recognizing him from his occasional appearances in town. Her voice carried the cultured accent of Eastern education overlaid with something deeper, more musical. "This is unexpected. How may I help you?" "Miss Crowfeather," Jake replied, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands. "I apologize for the late hour, but I have a proposition that might interest you. A business arrangement that could benefit us both." Sarah studied his weathered face, noting the sincerity in his storm-gray eyes. After a moment she stepped aside. "Please come in. Would you care for some coffee? I was just finishing my lesson plans for tomorrow." The schoolhouse was immaculate and thoughtfully arranged. Children's artwork decorated the walls alongside maps and educational charts. Books were neatly organized on shelves, and Sarah's desk showed the careful organization of a dedicated educator. Jake noticed several books in what he assumed was the Cheyenne language alongside volumes of Shakespeare, mathematics texts, and scientific journals. "You read Cheyenne?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the books. "I speak, read, and write in 3 languages," Sarah replied, pouring coffee from a pot that had been warming on the small stove. "English, Cheyenne, and French. My grandmother insisted I maintain my connection to our traditional knowledge while pursuing Western education. She believed that understanding multiple worlds would make me stronger." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, noting its excellent quality. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She died last winter, which is part of why I accepted this position. She always said that education was the bridge between worlds, and that someone had to be willing to stand on that bridge, even if it meant standing alone." "You're not alone," Jake said quietly. "At least you don't have to be." Sarah raised an eyebrow, settling into the chair across from him. "I'm listening, Mr. Thompson." Jake took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would sound insane to most people. "I want to marry you." Sarah's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. I beg your pardon? Not for love or romance, Jake continued quickly, his words coming out in a rush. For practicality. A business arrangement pure and simple. You need protection from the small minds in this town, and I need the gossip to stop following me up to my mountain every time I come to town for supplies. Sarah set down her cup carefully, her expression unreadable. You would marry a stranger to stop gossip? I would marry an educated, capable woman to give her the protection of a respected name while allowing her to continue the important work she's doing, Jake corrected. And you're not exactly a stranger. I've been watching how you handle yourself in this town, and I respect what I've seen. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Thompson? Jake leaned forward, his hands clasped around his coffee cup. A marriage of convenience. You would take my name, which carries some weight in this territory. You'd have the protection that comes with being a married woman, and the gossips would have to find something else to occupy their time. In return, you could continue teaching without harassment, and I could come to town without being subjected to lectures about your supposed influence on the community. And what would you expect from me in this arrangement? Nothing beyond what you're comfortable giving, Jake said honestly. You keep your independence, your work, your life. I live in a cabin up in the mountains, plenty of room, good location, peaceful. You could continue teaching and just exist without constantly having to prove yourself worthy of basic human respect. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face in the lamplight. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Because it's right, Jake said simply. Because watching good people suffer while small-minded folks make their lives miserable doesn't sit well with me. And because I think you're exactly the kind of teacher these children need, regardless of what some ignorant people think about your heritage. You realize this would be a permanent arrangement? Marriage isn't something that can be easily undone, especially out here. I understand that. But I also understand that sometimes doing the right thing requires a permanent commitment. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened town where so many people wished she would simply disappear. What would the living arrangements be? Separate rooms, separate lives under the same roof. You'd have complete privacy and independence. I spend most of my time with the cattle anyway, so we'd barely see each other except at meals if you wanted to share them. And you would expect nothing intimate from this arrangement? Jake's face reddened slightly, but his voice remained steady. Nothing you didn't freely choose to give. This would be a legal marriage for practical purposes, nothing more. Sarah turned back to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. Mr. Thompson, what you're proposing is either the most generous gesture I've ever encountered, or the most foolish. Maybe both, Jake admitted with a slight smile. But I've been called worse things than generous and foolish. After another long moment of consideration, Sarah nodded slowly. Very well, Mr. Thompson. I accept your practical proposal. When would you like to have this ceremony? As soon as possible. The sooner we're married, the sooner the talk dies down and you can focus on teaching instead of defending your right to exist. 3 days later, they stood before Judge Harrison in his chambers, with only the required witnesses present. Sarah wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the richness of her dark hair and eyes. Jake wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed for the occasion. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. They exchanged vows that spoke of honor and respect rather than love and devotion. When Judge Harrison announced, "You may kiss the bride," Jake and Sarah looked at each other for a moment before Jake extended his hand. "Partners?" he asked. "Partners?" Sarah agreed, shaking his hand firmly. As they left the courthouse, now legally bound as husband and wife, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had gained protection and respectability, but she had also tied her fate to a man she barely knew. Jake, walking beside his new wife toward the wagon that would take them to his mountain home, felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had acted on impulse and principle, but now he had to live with the consequences of his decision. Neither of them could have imagined how profoundly this practical arrangement would change both their lives in ways that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with the human heart's capacity for unexpected transformation. The journey to Jake's mountain cabin took 3 hours through winding trails that climbed steadily into the Colorado Rockies. Sarah rode beside him in comfortable silence, her sharp eyes taking in the magnificent landscape that would now be her home. The aspens were turning golden with autumn, and the air grew crisp and clean as they gained elevation. "It's beautiful," Sarah said as they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. "I can understand why you chose to live up here." "It's peaceful," Jake replied. "No neighbors to worry about, no gossip, no politics. Just the land, the cattle, and the weather. And now a wife, Sarah added with a slight smile. Jake glanced at her, noting the humor in her voice. And now a wife, he agreed. Though I suspect you'll fit in better than most folks would. You seem comfortable with solitude. I've spent most of my life caught between two worlds, Sarah said thoughtfully. Solitude has been a frequent companion. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was larger than Sarah had expected. Built of solid logs with a stone foundation, it sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines. A barn and several outbuildings suggested a well-established operation, and the sound of lowing cattle drifted from nearby pastures. It's not fancy, Jake said, suddenly self-conscious about his bachelor quarters, but it's solid and warm. Sarah dismounted and walked slowly around the cabin, taking in the practical details. The roof was well maintained, the windows were clean, and the porch was sturdy. It's perfect, she said sincerely. Much better than the boarding house room I've been renting in town. Inside, the cabin revealed itself to be surprisingly well organized for a bachelor's dwelling. The main room combined kitchen, dining, and sitting areas, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A narrow staircase led to a loft, and two doors opened off the main room. That's my room, Jake said, indicating the larger door. The smaller room is yours. It's not big, but it has a good window and stays warm. Sarah's room was indeed small but charming, with a single bed, a dresser, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the valley. Someone had clearly made an effort to make it welcoming. There were clean sheets on the bed, fresh flowers in a jar on the dresser, and even a small bookshelf. Did you do this? Sarah asked, touched by the thoughtful details. Jake's face reddened slightly. Figured you'd want a place that felt like yours. Over the following days, they established routines that allowed them to coexist as polite strangers. Jake rose before dawn to tend his cattle, while Sarah prepared for her daily ride to town to teach. They shared breakfast in comfortable silence, and Sarah would return each evening to find Jake either working around the property or reading by the fireplace. But as the days passed, Jake began to notice things about his new wife that surprised him. Sarah had quietly reorganized his chaotic kitchen with an efficiency that made cooking and cleaning infinitely easier. She had mended tears in his clothes without being asked, using techniques that made the repairs nearly invisible. Most intriguingly, she had started a small garden using methods he had never seen before. Where did you learn to plant like that? Jake asked one evening, watching Sarah arrange seeds in carefully planned patterns that seemed to follow some complex system. My grandmother taught me, Sarah replied, her hands gentle as she worked the soil. Cheyenne women have been making things grow in difficult conditions for generations. The plants support each other when they're arranged properly. Some provide nutrients, others offer protection, and together they create a system that's stronger than any individual plant could be alone. Jake found himself fascinated by the garden's progress. Within weeks, plants were thriving in soil he had always considered too rocky and poor for cultivation. Sarah's methods seemed to work with the natural environment rather than fighting against it. One evening, Jake returned from checking his cattle to find Sarah in the barn, treating a wounded calf with the skill of a trained veterinarian. Her hands moved with practiced confidence as she cleaned and dressed a deep cut on the animal's leg. Where did you learn veterinary medicine? Jake asked, amazed by her competence. I studied many subjects back east, Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. Medicine, both human and animal, was part of my education. My teachers believed that knowledge should be practical as well as theoretical. The calf, which Jake had been prepared to lose, recovered completely under Sarah's care. Word of her healing skills began to spread among the neighboring ranchers, and soon people were bringing injured animals to the Thompson Ranch for treatment. Jake also discovered that Sarah was a voracious reader with interests that ranged far beyond education. Her personal collection included books on medicine, agriculture, literature, philosophy, and science. She spoke 3 languages fluently and could discuss topics from astronomy to botany with equal intelligence. You're not what I expected, Jake admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, Sarah reading a medical journal while he worked on repairing a bridle. What did you expect? Sarah asked, looking up from her reading. I don't know, Jake said honestly. Someone simpler, I suppose. Someone who needed more taking care of. And instead you got someone who reorganized your kitchen and turned your barn into a veterinary clinic, Sarah said with amusement. Among other things, Jake replied. You've improved this place in ways I never thought possible. For the first time since their marriage, Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face and made Jake's heart skip unexpectedly. Knowledge is only valuable if it's used, Sarah said. "I'm glad I can contribute something useful to our arrangement." But Jake was beginning to realize that Sarah's contributions went far beyond the practical. Her presence had brought a warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Her quiet intelligence challenged him to think about things he had never considered. Her grace and dignity reminded him daily that strength came in many forms. Most surprisingly, Jake found himself looking forward to Sarah's return from town each day. Their evening conversations had become the highlight of his day, and he caught himself listening for the sound of her horse's hooves on the trail. One evening, as Sarah prepared lesson plans for the next day, Jake watched her work and felt a strange stirring in his chest. This woman, who had married him out of necessity, was transforming not just his home but something deeper within himself. "Sarah," he said quietly. She looked up, and for a moment their eyes met across the lamplight. Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that their practical arrangement was becoming something neither had planned for. "Yes," she said softly. "Thank you," Jake said, "for everything you've done here. For making this place feel like a home." Sarah's expression softened. "Thank you for giving me a place where I can be myself without apology." As they returned to their respective activities, both were aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The polite distance they had maintained was giving way to something warmer, more complex. Neither was ready to name what was growing between them, but both could feel it. A connection that had nothing to do with their practical arrangement and everything to do with two lonely souls discovering that they were no longer alone. November brought the first serious snowfall to the mountains, and with it, a new intimacy born of necessity. The daily trips to town became impossible during the worst weather, forcing Jake and Sarah to spend long days together in the cabin. What might have been awkward confinement instead became an opportunity for deeper connection. Sarah used the time to catch up on her lesson planning and to read from Jake's surprisingly extensive library. She discovered that her taciturn husband was far more educated than his rough exterior suggested. His shelves held works of literature, history, and philosophy alongside practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry. "You've read Emerson?" Sarah asked one snowy afternoon, finding a well-worn copy of Self-Reliance among his books. Jake looked up from the harness he was mending by the fire. "My father was a schoolteacher before he came west. He insisted I get a proper education, even if I chose to use it raising cattle instead of teaching children." "There's wisdom in both paths," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him. "Emerson would say that following your own nature is the highest form of education." "What does your nature tell you?" Jake asked, his hands stilling on the leather. Sarah considered the question seriously. "That knowledge without compassion is empty, and that the greatest teaching happens not in classrooms but in how we treat each other when no one is watching." Their conversations during those snowy days ranged from philosophy to practical matters, from childhood memories to dreams for the future. Jake learned that Sarah had lost her parents to disease when she was 12, and had been raised by her grandmother, who had insisted she pursue education as a way to bridge the gap between the traditional Cheyenne world and the changing reality of the American West. Sarah learned that Jake had come west after losing his father in the Civil War, seeking solitude and purpose in the mountains. He had built his ranch from nothing, learning through trial and error how to survive in the harsh mountain environment. "Why did you never marry before?" Sarah asked one evening as they prepared dinner together, their movements around the small kitchen now synchronized through weeks of practice. Jake was quiet for a moment, stirring the stew while Sarah sliced bread. "Never found anyone who could tolerate the isolation, I suppose. Most women want society, neighbors, a social life. I never had much to offer in that regard." "And now you're married to someone who chose to live between worlds," Sarah observed. "Perhaps isolation isn't the burden you thought it was." "Perhaps not," Jake agreed, glancing at her with an expression that made Sarah's heart flutter unexpectedly. The turning point came during a particularly severe blizzard that lasted 3 days. On the second night, the wind was so fierce that it rattled the cabin's sturdy walls, and the temperature dropped so low that even the large fireplace struggled to keep the main room warm. Sarah woke in the middle of the night, shivering despite her heavy quilts. The small room that had seemed cozy in milder weather now felt like an icebox. She wrapped a blanket around herself and ventured into the main room, thinking to build up the fire. She found Jake already there, feeding logs into the fireplace. He had clearly been awake for some time, monitoring the fire to keep the cabin habitable. "Can't sleep either?" he asked softly, not wanting to wake her if she had been sleeping. "Too cold," Sarah admitted, moving closer to the fire. "I don't think my room is going to be livable tonight." Jake looked at her, noting how she was shivering despite the blanket. You can sleep out here by the fire. I'll bring down some extra blankets from the loft. What about you? You need sleep too. I'll be fine. I'm used to cold nights. But as the night wore on, it became clear that even the main room was barely warm enough for one person, let alone two sleeping separately. When Sarah woke to find Jake sitting in a chair by the fire, clearly having not slept at all, she made a decision that surprised them both. "This is ridiculous," she said, standing up from her makeshift bed on the floor. "We're both adults and we're both freezing. The bed in your room is large enough for two people to sleep without complications." Jake's eyes widened. "Sarah, I don't think." "I'm not suggesting anything improper," Sarah said firmly. "I'm suggesting that we share body heat to survive the night, like any two people would in a survival situation. We can maintain perfect propriety while not freezing to death." After a moment of hesitation, Jake nodded. "If you're sure you're comfortable with that." They arranged themselves on opposite sides of Jake's large bed, fully clothed and with a careful distance between them. But as the night progressed and the cold intensified, they found themselves gradually moving closer together, until Sarah was curled against Jake's side and his arm was around her shoulders. "Is this all right?" Jake whispered, acutely aware of her warmth against him. "It's perfect," Sarah murmured, feeling safer and warmer than she had in months. They woke the next morning still entwined, and for a moment neither moved, reluctant to break the spell of intimacy that had settled over them. When Sarah finally lifted her head to look at Jake, she found him watching her with an expression of wonder. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," she replied, suddenly aware of how natural it felt to wake up in his arms. The blizzard passed, but something fundamental had changed between them. They no longer maintained the careful distance they had established. Their hands brushed more often during daily tasks. They sat closer together by the fire in the evenings. Their conversations became more personal, more revealing. One evening, as Sarah was teaching Jake some basic Cheyenne phrases, their lesson was interrupted by a commotion outside. A group of men on horseback had ridden up to the cabin, their voices loud and aggressive. Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, with Sarah beside him. The visitors were led by Samuel Morrison from town, accompanied by several other men Jake recognized as troublemakers. "Thompson," Morrison called out, his voice slurred with alcohol. "We've come to see what you're hiding up here with your Indian wife. Some folks in town are saying she's been practicing witchcraft, healing animals with savage magic." "You're drunk, Morrison," Jake said coldly. "And you're trespassing. I suggest you ride back to town before you do something you'll regret." "We just want to see what kind of unnatural things she's been doing," another man called out. "Decent folks have a right to know if there's devil worship happening in these mountains." Sarah stepped forward, her shotgun steady in her hands. "Gentlemen," she said with icy politeness, "you're trespassing on private property. My husband and I are well within our rights to defend our home against intruders." "Husband?" Morrison laughed harshly. "You mean your business partner? Everyone knows this ain't a real marriage. No white man would actually bed down with a savage." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Jake's rifle came up fast, but before he could speak, Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Morrison," she said with deadly calm, "you're mistaken about the nature of my marriage. My husband and I have a relationship that's based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. I realize those concepts might be foreign to someone of your limited experience, but I assure you our marriage is as real as any in this territory." Jake looked at Sarah in surprise, hearing something in her voice that went beyond mere defiance of the intruders. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "if you're concerned about unnatural practices, perhaps you should examine your own behavior. Riding armed onto private property to harass a married couple seems far more unnatural than anything you might imagine we're doing here." The men, faced with two determined defenders and the clear illegality of their position, began to back down. Morrison made a few more muttered threats, but eventually led his group back down the mountain. After they had gone, Jake and Sarah stood on the porch in the gathering darkness, the adrenaline of confrontation slowly fading. "You called me your husband," Jake said quietly. "You called me your wife," Sarah replied. They looked at each other in the lamplight spilling from the cabin, and suddenly the pretense that had sustained them for months fell away completely. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "No," Sarah agreed, stepping closer to him. "It wasn't." "I love you," Jake said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not as a business partner or a convenient arrangement. I love you, Sarah Crowfeather Thompson." "And I love you," Sarah whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "My stubborn, honorable, impossible cowboy. Their first real kiss was everything their practical arrangement had not been: passionate, tender, full of promise and hope. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now," Jake said, pulling her close, "we stop pretending this is just business and start building something real." As they stood together on their mountain porch, surrounded by the vast wilderness that had brought them together, both knew that their marriage of convenience had become something far more precious. A love that had grown slowly and surely, rooted in respect and nurtured by shared challenges. The practical arrangement that had been meant to silence gossips had given them something far more valuable: a partnership of hearts that would weather any storm. Spring arrived in the Colorado mountains, and Jake and Sarah's marriage had blossomed into genuine love. Sarah continued teaching while her medical skills gained respect throughout the territory. The townspeople's attitudes gradually shifted as they witnessed her wisdom and kindness. "You've changed," Sarah observed one morning as they worked in their expanded garden. "You smile more, seem lighter." "Love will do that to a man," Jake replied, kissing her gently. "Especially when married to a woman who challenges him to be better." Their physical relationship had developed naturally. Sarah had moved into Jake's room, converting her former space into a study. One evening, watching the sunset, Sarah made a joyful announcement. "I'm with child," she said quietly, hand resting on her stomach. Jake's face lit up with wonder. "Our baby," he whispered, holding her close. The pregnancy news brought final acceptance from the community. Even Mrs. Pemberton, once Sarah's harshest critic, brought baby clothes as a peace offering. Their greatest test came when Commissioner Bradley arrived to investigate their marriage's legitimacy, suspecting it was fraudulent to avoid territorial Indian policies. "Our marriage began practically but became something meaningful," Sarah declared with dignity. "We're partners in every sense: work, home, hearts, and future." Jake stood beside her. "She's transformed my entire life. If that's not a real marriage, I don't know what is." Seeing their shared life, photographs, mingled books, baby preparations, Bradley concluded their marriage was genuine. When their daughter Mary was born in November, the entire community celebrated. She became a symbol of unity, proof that love could bridge any divide. Years later, their mountain cabin became a gathering place for all backgrounds. Jake and Sarah had proven that the strongest marriages grow from respect and partnership, not just passion. The arrangement meant to silence gossips had given them something precious: a love lasting a lifetime and a legacy inspiring generations.